Can you imagine that Ferrari didn't know where Hamilton was in full race? And that your own boss blames it openly in public? What Frédéric Vasseur discovered after the GP of Great Britain 2025 is the type of revelation that can change the course of a season or a complete race. Since his arrival in Maranello, his speech had remained coherent: protect the pilots, assume errors as a team, and project a unity image. But that narrative began to crack in Silverstone. After a career marked by tactical confusion and low performance, Vasseur adopted a completely different tone than usual. Instead of defending his pilots, he slid a direct criticism. The car was the potential too. It was the pilots who did not raise everything in the decisive return. A phrase that apparently could sound diplomatic, but that in the context of Formula One modern, where each word is measured equivalent to a judgment of responsibility. It was not only a technical evaluation, it was a deep change in Ferrari's institutional discourse. This strategic turn by Vasseur was as subtle as devastating. It meant leaving behind the story of "we are all part of the problem" to start identifying individual responsible. And in this case, the main recipient was Hamilton. For a pilot who arrived in Ferrari with the expectation of being the center of the new winning cycle, the coup was unexpected. The rupture was not limited to a simple technical criticism. It was a public notice that the shield that Vasseur had raised since 2023 to protect his pilots was falling. The implications were multiple. On the one hand, it confirmed that internally it is perceived that the car, despite its problems, has a competitive potential. On the other, suggested that accumulated frustration was reaching a boiling point. Vasseur is a calculating director. If he opted for this change in his narrative, it was not for impulse or by media pressure. It was a maneuver designed to cause a reaction. Internally, these types of statements serve as a catalyst. They generate discomfort, yes, but they also install an emergency sensation. In terms of internal policy, it is a force movement that seeks to redefine the balance of responsibilities within the team. And the fact that he did after a GP with obvious errors, both technical and strategic, gives signs that he is willing to sacrifice part of the public cohesion of the team in order to push his key figures to another level of performance. At the narrative level, what happened in Silverstone marks the beginning of a different stage for Ferrari. It is no longer about telling a story of future redemption, but about facing the failures of the present with crudeness. In other words, the romantic story of a Hamilton redeemer behind the wheel of a mythical Ferrari has begun to give way to a much more tense story, much more human and therefore much more real. That of a team that cannot afford more errors and that, in its urgency to return to the top, has decided to change the rules of the game. What happened with the GPS system of the Hamilton car in Silverstone was, without exaggerating, one of the most alarming episodes in Ferrari's recent modern history. At first glance, a technical failure may seem part of the usual risk in a sport as complex as Formula One. But when the context, the consequences and decisions that derive from that anomaly are analyzed in detail, it is clear that this incident represents much more. It is the portrait of an operational vulnerability in a team that cannot allow errors of this magnitude. It all started after the 10th return of the Grand Prix. Ferrari's technical team, located in the pit wall, completely lost the digital trail of the car number 44. The position telemetry, usually transmitted through the global positioning system, was disconnected without prior notice, leaving the team literally blindly regarding Lewis's location on the track. In an environment where every second counts and where strategic decisions are based on real-time data, that blindness was devastating. What for the public was just one more race, for Maranello's team was a tactical nightmare from beginning to end. The lack of GPS not only prevented the team from planning an effective strategy, he also committed the pilot's rhythm, the coordination of radio messages, and above all, decisions about boxes. Without knowing where Hamilton was or his exact gap with respect to his closest rivals, Ferrari had to trust ancient calculations, inaccurate estimates, and external visual references. That, in the current Formula One, is to play with a bandage. The boxes stopped in Tour 41 is one of the most dramatic examples of what happens when a team loses control of its strategy. At that time, an important degradation had accumulated in Hamilton's tires, but there was still room to wait. However, without exact data, it was chosen to anticipate arrest. The result was disastrous. Hamilton came out in traffic, lost rhythm when reinstating in curves 3 and 4, and was overcome by Nico Hülkenberg, who ended up stealing a key position on the track. This tactical error, direct product of the GPS disconnection, not only cost Hamilton valuable time, but exposed Ferrari's total dependence towards his digital infrastructure. And that is the most worrying. Because an elite team cannot allow an isolated software failure to collapse its entire operation. The backup system failed, the team's response was reactive instead of proactive, and, the most serious of all, there was no effective improvised solution during the race. On a competitive level, what happened in Silverstone resonates as a warning. It is no longer enough to have a competitive car or two experienced pilots. Modern Formula One is a war of information. And Ferrari that day lost the most important battle, that of situational control. This episode leaves many open questions. Was it a timely failure or the symptom of a system that is not up to the current standards? Are there deeper problems in the integration between the technical team and the car? And above all, how does this impact a pilot's confidence as Hamilton, who already arrives with a demanding adaptation curve? Silverstone's GPS not only represents a technical failure, it is a brutal metaphor of what is happening in Ferrari, a team that at times seems to have been aimlessly in full race to return to the top. When the noise of public statements is turned off and looks under the hood of the SF25, what emerges is an even more uncomfortable truth for Ferrari. The car simply does not live up to the expectations created around it. And what is worse, its defects are not smaller or easily corrected. These are structural, base design problems, which limit their competitiveness in different types of circuit and that particularly affect Lewis Hamilton's driving style. What was interpreted as a promising car has been transformed, after only some races, into a technical challenge full of internal contradictions. The first big failure is in the rear suspension. Ferrari opted for a softer configuration than usual, thinking of maximizing comfort in circuits with high aerodynamic load. The theory behind this decision was clear, allowing a greater range of adjustment in the height of the car to better adapt to different track profiles. But in practice, this approach has failed flatly. The soft torsional rigidity has generated a loss of stability in rapid curves, just where the car is needed to transmit security to the pilot. And this is where the situation is complicated for Hamilton. Lewis has a very fine driving style, dependent on the predictable behavior of the rear axle to maximize its curve entrance. When that stability is committed, its confidence level falls into minced. What could be manageable for another pilot, for Hamilton it is a source of instability that directly affects its performance. The situation is even more serious if it is considered that the car does not allow an aggressive customization of the setup without compromising other critical equilibrium elements. The introduction of a new pull rod-type front suspension, designed to release aerodynamic space and improve the efficiency of the flow under the chassis, has only added one more complexity layer. This technical innovation, led by engineer Loic Serra, intended to give SF25 an advantage over its direct rivals, especially in the most technical sections. But what has caused is a general unbalance on the platform. The front is too reactive, while the rear does not offer the necessary support. The result is a car with erratic, unpredictable behavior, especially in changing conditions such as those lived in Silverstone. To this are added other problems of difficult resolution, an extreme sensitivity to the changes of height by aerodynamic load, a platform that loses yield if minimally departs from the optimal window, and a curve performance that varies drastically according to the type of asphalt. In summary, the SF25 is a car with an unbalanced base, which requires an almost perfect tuning to work. And that, in a 24-run calendar with constantly changing conditions, is practically a sentence of permanent frustration. The most worrying thing about all this is that Ferrari knows it. The technical address of the team is aware of these defects, but the solution is not simple. Correcting the suspension architecture implies redesign key pieces that affect monozygasco. And that is not something that can be done from one weekend to another. It requires time, resources, and, above all, political decision within the team to assume that a concept error has been made. Thus, Hamilton's true enemy is not his teammate or the wall engineers, not even media pressure. The true enemy is the SF25, a car that promised to be Ferrari's rebirth and that has so far behaved more as a brake than as a championship tool. And as long as that root problem is not addressed, nor the talent of Hamilton or Vasseur's strategies will be enough to return Ferrari to the top. Because in Formula One, if your car is not at the level, everything else collapses. Every weekend without solid results erodes a little more the credibility of the project. Each technical error, each strategic failure, each contradictory statement adds to the feeling that Ferrari is trapped in a cycle that does not break. The Hamilton case is not just that of a pilot who struggles to adapt. It is the mirror where Ferrari is seeing its own reflected limitations. A team that aspired to redeem himself through the talent of a champion, but that, for now, seems more concerned with holding a facade than to face his true technical ghosts. I want to know your opinion. Do you think that Vasseur is acting with intelligence by changing his speech? Or do you think he is beginning to lose control of the internal story? Does SF25 have arrangement? Is there a future in this project, or is it another promise that will end up forgotten in the recent history of the team?